Hey, it's Art from My New Microphone. In this video, let's discuss my top 8 tips for improving your mix translatability. Mix translatability, as the name would suggest, is the subjective ability for our mixes to translate from one system to another and sound great on as many different playback systems as possible. It's one thing to get our mixes sounding great in our studio on our monitors that we're very familiar with, but a completely other thing to have that mix translate to other playback systems like the car, the home theater system, Bluetooth speakers, earbuds, the list goes on and on. So in this video, let's discuss my top 8 tips for improving your mix translatability. From a listener's perspective, the factors that influence translatability include the speakers or headphones, the amplifiers, the room acoustics, environmental noise, and much, much more. So it's important to get a mix that will sound good regardless of what it is played back on. So let's get into the tips. And tip number 1 is mixing in mono. This one may come as no surprise as many playback systems reproduce sound in mono. Think of large PA systems or your smartphone or Bluetooth speakers. And so if we want our mixes to translate to all different systems, then we have to make sure that our mixes sound good in mono. This means mixing in mono at least partially throughout the mixing process. We can opt for a setup where we have a mono monitor in addition to our stereo monitors and a monitor switching system that allows us to switch back and forth to monitor in mono versus stereo. Or an easier way of doing this is to set up a gain or utility plugin on the mix bus that allows us to toggle our stereo input to a mono output. This way we can easily collapse or sum the mix to mono for mono referencing. Notice how the sides information comes down when we reference in mono, along with the sense of separation between the different elements in the mix. Try to find a nice happy medium between having a nice wide mix in stereo and a strong mono compatible mix in the center. Doing so will help your mixes translate to mono playback systems and even other stereo playback systems. I have videos on mixing in mono, as well as my top tips for getting width in a mix. I will leave those links in the description down below. Tip number 2 for improved mix translatability is to focus your efforts in the mid-range. If you've been mixing or learning about mixing for a while, you've likely come across some iteration of the phrase, "the magic is in the mid-range." Many of my mentors have told me this, and I'm here to repeat that to you today. The reproduction of low-end and high-end information will vary quite dramatically from playback system to playback system. However, most systems will do a fairly decent job of recreating the all-important mid-range frequencies. Furthermore, the most important harmonic or musical information is held within this mid-range, roughly between 200 hertz to 4000 hertz. So if we can really nail the mid-range, we can ensure that our mixes will do a better job translating from the best systems to the worst systems and everything in between. Much like monitoring in mono, we can actually opt for a playback system that is relatively poor at reproducing the low and high-end energy that will focus our efforts on the mid-range. Or we could use an EQ with a bandpass filter that shaves off the low end and the high end, put that EQ on the mix bus and make mixing decisions from there. Again, do this periodically and make sure that you're switching between this bandpassed version of the mix and the full band version of the mix. I actually have a video on the latter of these two techniques. I'll leave a link to that in the description box down below as well. Tip number 3 is to improve our monitoring situation. Proper monitoring can make a massive difference in how well our mixes translate if we can hear and understand what our mixes sound like properly within the studio. First and foremost, before we go spending tons of cash on the monitors with the best frequency response, it's perhaps more important to really understand the monitoring situation we have now before moving forward. In other words, before improving our gear, we should opt to improve our response to the gear that we already have. As an example, the Yamaha NS10s, while out of production and somewhat controversial, have become industry standard monitors for mixing engineers, even though they have anything but a flat frequency response. But even though the NS10s are far from technically perfect, their focus on the mid-range makes them perfect for many mixing engineers who understand their sound and how their mixes can translate from these monitors to other playback systems. So again, this tip is not about buying the best monitors that your money can afford, but rather spending the time to understand exactly how your monitors, your headphones, and your room at large sound. More expensive monitors may be technically better than what you have now, and it may be better to have multiple pairs of monitors to switch between throughout the mixing process. But the main point here is to get to know your monitors, your headphones, and your room as good as possible, and to understand how they sound in order to improve your mix translatability from playback system to playback system. We also need to factor in the physical space that we are mixing within and the monitor placement, as well as any acoustic treatment that we have in the room. Proper monitor position and acoustic treatment can work wonders in improving your mixing environment and ultimately your mix translatability. For example, my current room is about 150 square feet. I'm actually running it out of a spare bedroom in my house at the moment. I have the Prima Acoustic London 12 panels. You can see them behind me, the 4 panels behind me. I have other ones around my room as well. And I use the Yorkville YSM 5 monitors right here as my stereo pair of monitors. And I understand how my room sounds with these monitors after having mixed here for well over a year. So while I don't have the most expensive gear, I can use what I have and understand how it will translate to different playback systems, having had experience in this room with these speakers in a variety of different mixes. Speaking of monitoring, this brings us to tip number 4, which is monitoring in as many familiar playback systems as possible outside the studio. Of course, proper monitoring is important within the studio. We just discussed that. But mix translatability is ultimately about having your mixes sounding good on all systems. And the end listener is not going to be listening to your mixes in your studio. They'll be listening on their playback systems. So it's important to have your mixes sound good there. So find your favorite and most familiar playback systems and spend some time listening critically, not only to your own mixes, but to commercially released mixes in many genres to really get a sense of what those playback systems sound like. Then, once you bounce out your mix and you play it back on those systems, you'll have a sense of what good mixes should sound like, and you can make any necessary adjustments to help with your mix translatability throughout these different playback systems as needed. Tip number 5 for improving your mix translatability is to find your preferred listening level, but to monitor at many different levels throughout the mixing process. Finding a safe, practical level to monitor at and practicing mixing at that level will give you a more consistent experience and feedback from your monitoring system. However, for the best mix translatability, we should be monitoring at different levels throughout the mixing process. When we're monitoring very low, our ears will be less sensitive to the low end and the high end, and will be more focused on that all-important mid-range. And if we really crank it up, we can listen at very short times without sustaining hearing damage to a more balanced mix with much more low-end and high-end representation, and we can really feel that mix by having the sub-frequencies hit into our chest. Beyond that, it's important to monitor at low levels because some people listen to music at low levels, as well as high levels because many people listen to music at very high levels, and everywhere in between. But find a comfortable, safe listening volume that you can go back to time and time again throughout your mixes for, again, a more consistent mixing experience. I actually have a video on the subject going into much more detail about how we hear sound differently at varying sound pressure levels. I'll leave a link to that video in the description if you'd like to check that one out. Tip number 6 is to utilize reference mixes properly. Commercially released music that's been mixed and mastered by professionals tends to translate pretty well. Therefore, if we can get our mixes sounding in the same ballpark, especially in the low end and the high end, as well as the mid-range, then we can expect our mixes to translate pretty well as well. Combining a few of the previous tips, we should be referencing our mix against our references, not only inside the studio, but also outside the studio in as many familiar playback systems as possible. I have a video going into depth about using reference mixes and the tools I use to reference my mixes inside the mixing session. I'll leave a link to that video in the description box down below if you are interested in checking that one out. Tip number 7 for improving mix translatability is to practice critical listening. This is a vital skill to have as a mixing engineer, mastering engineer, or music producer that helps us really hone in and understand what works in professional mixes. And once we know what works, we can develop our mixing skills to make those things happen in our own mixes for better mix translatability. By listening critically to our mixes, especially after having some time off away from them, we can really hear what is going wrong in terms of mix translatability. And as we understand more about mixing, we will be able to identify those issues and fix them in the mix. I have a video on critical listening that I think you should check out. I will leave a link to that video in the description box down below. And tip number 8 is to hire a proficient mastering engineer. Modern mastering of music has a lot to do with ensuring that music translates as best as possible from one playback system to another playback system. So if you can hire a mastering engineer for yourself and have a dialogue between yourself and the mastering engineer, you can pinpoint issues that may be present in your mix that may affect that mix's ability to translate from system to system once it's mastered. If you can find a mastering engineer that is willing to have a dialogue with you, I would go ahead and suggest doing so to help ensure that your mixes are as good as possible before mastering in terms of the potential for mixed translatability. All right, so those are my 8 mixed translatability tips. Once again, they are mixing in mono, focusing on the mid-range, improving your monitoring situation in your studio, monitoring outside your studio as much as possible on familiar systems, finding your preferred monitoring level, but monitoring at different levels throughout the mixing process as well, using proper reference mixes, practicing critical listening, and finally, hiring a mastering engineer that can help pinpoint any issues that you have in your mixes. What do you think of these tips? Do you agree or disagree with some of them? Are there any that you'd like to add? Should this list have been 9, 10, 11, or 12 tips rather than 8? Let me know in the comments down below. If you'd like to learn more about mixing in a practical way, I put together a free mixing guidebook for you. I'll leave a link to that. It'll be the first link in the description box down below. So you can click that, sign up to my newsletter, and I'll send that over to you right away. This helps you make the right mixing decisions at the right time for better and more consistent mixes that translate better from playback system to playback system. So once again, first link in the description box if you are interested. If you found this content helpful, I would encourage you to hit that like button and subscribe here to the My New Microphone YouTube channel. And as always, I will leave another few videos up in the top left and right corner for other videos that I've done that I think will be of great interest for you. So check out one of those videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.